want to thank our sponsor, Newmark Watch Company, who are a British-owned brand who create some stunning timepieces such as their 52 Field Watch that come in 2 colours, their classic 71 Sports which come in 3 colours, and the Water King that is up to 200 metres of water resistance. They also continue to award the Newmark Helicopter Flying Trophy each year at RAF Shawbury, where the trainee pilot with the highest marks is presented with the trophy and a 6BB watch. Visit their website at newmarkwatchcompany.com to discover all their collection, including the iconic 6BB chronograph that was issued to the RAF in the 1980s. Thank you and enjoy. Rob, when did you become interested in aviation?
I saw the movie Top Gun, like a lot of people did, except I was 7 years old in the early 90s, and I saw Top Gun. My dad sat me down to watch it, and I just became basically mesmerized by it, like a lot of people did all over the world, and especially here in the States. But then I just grew up, and I was like, no, I really, like, what is that? I want to be a Navy pilot. What does that mean? And then learned how that you had to become not just join the Navy or the Marine Corps to fly jets off carriers, but you had to become an officer. So like, what does that mean? And then how do you get commissioned? So then I eventually figured out I needed to go to the Naval Academy or go through Officer Candidate School, OCS, or ROTC, and pick one of the three. So eventually I set my sights on the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. And the rest is history. Just kind of focused on that all through middle school and high school, and wanted to become a Navy pilot real bad. And just that was my goal for better part of 20 years.
So can you talk us through, obviously, when you got into the Navy, some of the initial aircraft you started your training on?
Yeah, absolutely. So after I graduated from the Naval Academy, went down to flight school in Pensacola, Florida, for what's called API, Aviation Pre-Flight Indoctrination. Did that for 6 or 8 weeks or so, and then I went to Corpus Christi, Texas, and started flying the T-34 Turbo Mentor. At the time, they were replacing that with the T-6 Texan II, which is a beautiful ejection seat, glass cockpit aircraft that the Air Force bought, and then the Navy basically acquired it, put on bigger tires. But that was only on one half of the flight school pipeline. That was over on the Milton, Florida side, and I was in Corpus Christi, Texas. So in Texas, I flew the T-34, and then I got selected for tailhook, or they called it jets at the time. And then I went up and flew T-45s, the T-45 Goshawk, which is an equivalent or a version of the Hawk that you guys have over there in the UK. Again, a little beefed out. I think maybe some bigger fuel tanks on it, bigger tires, etc. And flew that for about a year. And then I got voluntold I'm going E2s or C2s. And then I went back to Corpus Christi, Texas to fly what they call the T-44, which is basically a King Air version. So multi-engine. So basically single engine piston, or I should say turbo or turboprop, and then jet, and then back to multi-engine turboprop. And then, I flew C2s starting in Norfolk, Virginia.
So did you get a choice between E2 and C2, and which was your preference?
So that's a great question. And what's ironic about that whole story is that I told you I was voluntold to go E2, C2. I mean, most of the things in the military, I'm sure over there in the UK and certainly here in the States, it's a lot of timing, a lot of luck. I was good enough to get selected for tailhook going from primary to Meridian, Mississippi, where I flew T-45s. And then I was voluntold to go E2. Basically, they call it E2 C2. So fast forward a year and a half, you're in Norfolk, and we were at they called it the RAG back in the day, the Replacement Air Group. Now it's nicknamed the FRS, the Fleet Replacement Squadron. So at the RAG, they fly E2s and C2s, and to train the replacement pilots going out to the fleet. And this was the first time in 2.5 years of flight school, after getting my wings, that they said, okay, we're going to leave it up to you guys. I think I had 7 people in my class, 2 C2 slots, and 4, is it 4? I think we'll say like 3 or 4 E2 slots on the West Coast, so California. Yeah. So there was, what was remaining was undesirable E2 slots in Norfolk, Virginia, and then desirable E2 slots in California, and then what people would consider the very desirable C2 slots, which we didn't know at the time, it was 1 Virginia, 1 California. So basically 6 of the 7 people, 6 guys and 1 girl, six of us wanted C2s, and we literally put our military IDs in a hat. We went to a local restaurant and talked about it and said, hey, this is what we're going to do first. I think one of the guys, the one guy who actually wanted E2s, he got to pick. We decided you get your first choice of E2s, California, or we're going to draw for C2s. So he drew our cards out and he drew me. and another girl's name hat out of the hat or card out of the hat, and we both got C2. So that's literally the story of how I got C2s was card pulled out of a hat for C2s.
So I have to ask, what were your first thoughts on the Greyhound?
Um, first thought, I didn't know what it was. I mean, all through my time in the military, certainly at the Naval Academy, I learned about it, but F-18, Super Hornet, Growler, all that stuff. Learn about other planes, the E2s and P3s going to P8s, and then you kind of like, what is that thing, the C2? I definitely thought it was a little ugly of an airplane at first, but once you start flying it, you get a newfound respect for just how big and how much power it has for basically not being really aerodynamic like a jet, because we're around the jet guys all the time. I went through flight school with these guys for many years, and when you're on the boat, when you're on the aircraft carrier, you're sleeping next to these guys, and so you really interact a lot, and you just realize how much bigger your plane is. But at the same time, like I said, there's that newfound respect for how hard it is to fly, especially with all that power and right rudder required, and just the tremendous horsepower to land on the carrier and certainly take off from it and to not kill yourself. So I definitely did not think it was the prettiest airplane, but it's kind of one of those, hey, only I can call it ugly kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like to everyone else, you're like, that's my baby. Spent a lot of time flying the C2 and just learned to love it. It's a great platform.
Absolutely. And before we get into your your ground and flying training, so what is the role of the C2, and has it changed when it was first designed to the time when you were flying it?
The answer is no. The role it's the nickname, the COD, COD, for Carrier Onboard Delivery. And to be clear, a lot of my YouTube videos that people are familiar with, I filmed those. I took those. I didn't necessarily intend to have a YouTube channel at the time. I filmed those around 2015, 2016, maybe a little bit 2017. But I've not flown the C2 in several years now. They are still flying the C2 as of today, 2024. It's supposed to have finished this year. Now it's going to be extended a couple more years, and maybe after that, because the Osprey is having its own issues, which I'm sure your viewers are aware of. But the design has not changed at all. It was designed in the 50s, the late 50s, first flown in 1962, I want to say, early 60s, replacing the C1 Trader. The C2 was the first time, I would say the first time, but the C2 was obviously a little bit of a copycat from the E2 that was designed at the time from Grumman, and it was purposely built and designed to be a cargo. So C standing for cargo. And the design from the 1962 model until today has not changed at all, mainly because there's only been one new production set of C2s that were produced in the early or mid 1980s. And that's what I flew. So I flew C2s that were designed in the 60s or designed in the 50s, first flown in the 60s, and then the ones we actually flew were built in the 80s. And no, it's not much to change at all, except for the inside. It's a lot more glass on the inside, still plenty of buttons to push, updated avionics, and then the most notably our propellers are 8-bladed props versus really up until I would say the late 2000s, maybe 2010-ish, they had 4-bladed props for the longest time. But the 8-bladed props, which you'll also find on C-130s and the E2 as well, they're really cool. They're really scary and awesome looking, but they really help with the performance, especially on cat shots.
Absolutely. So let's talk a bit about your ground and flying training, and how did you find it going through that?
I mean, honestly, for me, the flying was one of the easier parts. I felt like I was a natural stick when it came to hopping in the plane, a jet, or the C2. But for me, the hardest part was the studying. I mean, I went to the Naval Academy, which some people would really consider a prestigious university, and I'm really grateful to have gone there and feel very lucky to have gotten in and also to graduate. But it was nothing compared to flight school. My 2 years of flight school were pretty intense. For me, memorizing things, I can get it done, but memorizing a lot of things to the point of not missing a single punctuation and I'm talking EPs, emergency procedures, full on, we call them boldface items, anything that has to be memorized. We have this thing called a PCL, just like a thick book that's literally a short version of NATOPS, which we call Big Blue. NATOPS is the standardized instruction manual for all U.S. naval aircraft. That's literally 2 or 3 inches thick, depending on what aircraft you're flying. And the amount of, I mean, there are times to paint your viewers a picture. flight school, the instructor would walk in and say, okay, I'm a drop of oil, go. And you have to like go on the whiteboard behind you and draw the entire oil system and
Wow.
make a little dotted line saying, I'm oil going through the reduction gearbox. This is what happens. And if this had like the full thing. And then you take that for oil, electrical, fuel, if you have weapons on board, which we did not, but the Hornets, their weapon systems, I mean, the full thing, not to mention flying and procedures and then emergency procedures. And then, oh, actually, well, we're on this airfield, we do this, but then that airfield, we do that. But our NATOPS calls for this, but the air wing has its own SOP, but then the base has its own SOP, standard operating procedures, and just like all that stuff. It's just a lot. I mean, you eventually learn enough and memorize it. I don't want to, paint or portray it in a different way, but for me, the ability to juggle your life and also prepare for a flight the following day and have studied the night before, when you're throwing in 2 flights a day plus a simulator, for several weeks or months on end, it's just a lot. And I'm really happy I was, for the most part, single and young when I went through that phase of my life.
Yeah. And for our viewers who don't know, how many crew were on board? Was there like a co-pilot? Was the crew on board in the back all the time at loadies? I don't know if you call them that or.
Yeah, never called them loadies, but we just call them aircrewmen or load masters, depending on what they did. But we had 2 pilots up front. One's the pilot in command, one is the co-pilot. Unlike civilian flying or flying commercially, whoever was in charge of the plane was just the senior ranking officer or the senior ranking pilot. They were designated as the aircraft commander, but they could sit in the left or the right seat. So you could be sitting in the right seat, not in charge of flying the airplane, but still in charge of the overall decision making in the cockpit. And then we, in the back, at any given time, we had 1 to 3 aircrewmen, usually 2. For flying to the carrier, especially, we had to have 2, sometimes 3, depending on if we had more people. And 1 was the minimum if we were just doing what we call bouncing for FCLPs, field carrier landing practices. If we were just taking off, flying 15 minutes away, practicing our carrier landings on land, and then coming back a quick little hop like that, it was just one guy, a girl. But usually we had 2 aircrew in the back. And so with that, there were 30 souls on board the C-2. So 2 pilots, let's say 2 aircrewmen, and then 26 what we call them packs or passengers in the back, or up to 10,000 pounds of cargo. So you could have 2 pilots, 2 aircrewmen, and 10,000 pounds and room for no one else, or 2 pilots, 2 aircrewmen, and no cargo, and 26 passengers, or some combination thereof. So maybe you have 10 people on board and another 5,000 pounds of stuff in the back.
What was it actually like to fly? And you have to talk us through trapping on the boat and obviously taking off on the boat. What was that like?
Sure. Oh, man. Well, first of all, it was half a tremendous amount of fun and half at times nerve-wracking, to say the least. Every single time I landed on the boat was very, very nerve-wracking. I don't want to say scary. There were times where, you're thrown out of your comfort zone, even more so than just what you're doing landing on the carrier. But it was definitely a pinch me kind of moment every time you had to come in to trap the C-2 in the back, especially with people in the back. One, at a minimum, your air crew, 2 or 3 guys, 2 or 3 guys or girls in the back, that were entrusted with their lives, or obviously people that were flying out to the carrier, whether they're a brand new sailor. I mean, literally, you could have somebody who just finished boot camp 10 weeks ago, and now they're flying out to the carrier for the first time. Wow. So an 18, 19-year-old kid, or some admiral or some general who was about to retire after 30 years, or some senator, or a teacher from a school and on the East Coast who was going to get a goodwill flight. So it was pretty intense. The cat shots were very much a payback for all that. Certainly a lot of work in preparation. Hey, our weights and limits, working with our guys in the back. Are we good to go? Our engine's solid. I mean, you can watch the videos and, we're going through some checks there before we take off. But that initial, once you're hooked up, locked and loaded, you're kind of just holding on for dear life and enjoying the roller coaster ride. And then you take off. And a lot of times you're kind of up and away, flying straight ahead, or maybe turning to the right somewhere and flying. For us, it was a lot of times flying back to the Middle East from being in the Persian Gulf and flying back to basically a regular runway. So the stress kind of wore off. But the other way around, taking out from land, flying to the carrier, you're on land, you're kind of doing that stuff. And then you got to get in mind of, we're going blue water ops here. We call it feed wet, and just get in the zone. We would take off with headsets. And then when we or somewhere over the water. We put on our helmets, and you're basically just like, it's like going to battle. I mean, literally, except the battle was a mental gymnastics and don't mess this up, because I don't want to, be responsible for anything that could go wrong with our plane or for the planes that are on the flight deck coming into land when we come into land.
Absolutely. This kind of like nicely leads on to this question, but what would you say the strengths and weaknesses of the C2 were or are?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. Strengths are the very obvious that we are part of the air wing in the sense that we are an airplane that can trap and take a catapult shot off of the carrier, as opposed to the Osprey, where it is basically a big helimaflopter. I say that jokingly, and the entire flight deck has to shut down for that thing to come in to land and take off. Helicopters, regular 60s, like Blackhawks, like Navy versions of a Blackhawk, can come in and land on one side while we're doing cat shots off the bow. I mean, they can do that. I mean, there's logistics there. I'm sure somebody listening would correct me on, when that happens, but they can absolutely do that. They can basically slip in, slip out. We would literally trap first, and then the Hornets would come in, and then the E2 would come in behind us and close the stack. And so the idea of us trapping first was we'd come in, we'd be the lowest, we'd come in and trap, we'd get out of the way to the side, fold our wings, and then all the passengers and cargo would start getting unloaded. And if we were in a quick turn, basically the ship works as cycles. It's cats and then traps and then cats and then traps all day long, throughout the day. And so we would come in for a trap for an arrested landing. And then by the time that we were loaded up, we could basically make the next cycle and literally not even get out of the airplane if we didn't have to, and get gas while one engine shut down, where the other engine's on getting fuel. Aircrew in the back are unloading new stuff and loading new people in. And we would just literally sometimes switch seats if we wanted to. And then we would take a catapult shot. So that would be a big strength of the C2, is that it continues to blend in nicely with the air wing. It is purpose built to be a cargo platform to land on and off aircraft carriers. So it is a tremendous strength in that regard. Weaknesses, as of today, it would be its age. I mean, it's just showing its age. The planes that I flew were SLEP, SLEP, for Service Life Extension Program. So they were slept. And then at some point, again, they were super slept. So it's like, basically what that means is Grumman, now Northrop Grumman, says, hey, the service life on this airframe is X number of 1,000 hours or X number of years or combination thereof, or landings. And the Navy met that wicket, and then they basically asked for permission to extend it. And then they asked for permission to extend it again. So, at some point, metal does start to weaken, and that is a concern. But they're always doing very intense inspections. Every time we would fold the wings, let's say, you can only do that so many times before an actuator has to be replaced. So they're replacing parts constantly to keep it flying. But I would have loved to seen a C2B or a C3 kind of come into life, especially with the E2 Delta having come on board, and that was $187 million a pop. Ooh. And again, I'm not a congressman or a person of influence, and these decisions were made probably 20 years ago anyway. But that to me made the most sense of, hey, let's not, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Let's not try something new here. And that's kind of what we're seeing today with the Osprey. I mean, it's an amazing airframe. I've flown in one, in the back of one, and never flown in the cockpit, flown a simulator of one. It's incredible. But first and foremost, it was designed for the Marine Corps or the Air Force. It was designed for this kind of troop transport. It wasn't designed for aircraft carrier ops, and it can do it. Is it the best? I don't know. Maybe not.
We'll see, won't we?
Yeah.
But so I have to ask, what was life like on the boat as a COD pilot and crew as well? Did you all stay together, or did you mingle with other squadrons, other types, that kind of thing? How did that work, Rob?
So for us, for C2 guys, unfortunately, we only deployed as about 6 of us, with one extra being the officer in charge. So it was usually 6 junior officers and an OIC, so 7 pilots total. We had a maintenance officer, so it was 8 officers and about 40 enlisted. So it was only about 48 of us that deployed. And the idea is that there are 2 C2 squadrons, one in Norfolk, one in San Diego, Norfolk, Virginia, for people listening in the UK. And we have detachments. So I was on a det with the strike group for the Harry S. Truman. And so my det deployed with the air wing rather than all the Hornet guys and the E2 squadron. They deployed as a squadron. The the cons of that is that my new wife at the time, could only really kind of hang out with 5 or 6 other wives from the wives club that were their husbands were also deployed, right? Because the rest of the people are still back at home doing normal things. And there's kind of, whereas the other squadrons that were on the air wing, like everyone deployed. So you've got 30 or 40 pilots plus hundreds of enlisted, and they're all deployed. So back home, the wives and the spouses, they all really get to enjoy basically strength in numbers, and they have parties and events and stuff while their husbands are gone. And also, their ready rooms on the boat, they were always full. I mean, they had dedicated ready rooms. We did not. We were basically kind of the stepchild. We would hang out with the E2 guys, and then sometimes the Hornet guys would call us in, or they ask us to bring a pizza or a suit they got made in the local market, which we called the souk. So that was kind of the cons of being deployed. The way we were. The pros were is that we didn't have to sleep on the ship other than for a couple of weeks, which I will say on record as a COD guy, that was a few weeks too many. I mean, it's never sleeping on the carrier is fun for like 2 nights, and then you're like, okay, this gets old because, I mean, it's a big ship. There are 5,000 people on board, but it seems that they put the pilots right up to the top, and not that we shouldn't be there. I mean, no one deserves to be sleeping underneath the arresting cables or the catapult shots. I mean, if anything, the guys that are cooking for you should be having the best night's sleep, in my opinion. But it's just a warship, and there's no great there's no good time to sleep, honestly, because there's always flight ops, and sometimes they do nighttime ops for obvious reasons, and then that's terrible because during the day everyone's supposed to be asleep, but obviously everyone's rhythm's off, and then at nighttime they're just constant. And I'm not just talking about the landings; it's the cat shots too. And the cables are the do 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 do. It's very loud. It's a very loud environment. So that was the biggest con, was that we didn't have to sleep on the boat a lot. As much as I would have loved to flown jets in the Navy, we were literally flying back to a hotel for the most part. I was on deployment, and we stayed on there for a few weeks, leaving the eastern coast of the United States, going to Europe, and then we basically did this kind of tag team jumping on and off point. We would go from like Portugal to the ship, and then Spain to the ship, and then Italy to the ship, and then Greece to the ship, and then that's what we did. And then we basically kind of home based over in the Middle East for a few months, and while the ship did its thing, and then we came back and did the same thing going back to the States. So that was a lot of fun.
The best of both worlds, I suppose.
Yeah, it was good. Yeah, because we got to land on the carrier, obviously, and then okay, see you later. That's why in some of my videos I go, peace out, like, because we're leaving. I mean. And the Hornet guys, I mean, they give us crap all the time. Like, you guys are leaving. It's like, dude, you could have absolutely volunteered yourself to fly this, but you chose not to. And so these are the consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, like, you were speaking about night flying there. Was the COD like quite capable at night flying, or did it take like a lot of mental, arithmetic and concentration there?
Yeah, I mean, flying at night. I mean, I really enjoyed flying at night because it's a quieter time to fly, it seems. I mean, the air seems stiller, and I don't know if there's less people flying, but we only flew at night on land. We were never allowed to fly at night on the carrier. The last, I think, C-2 that flew to the boat at night was like mid 2000s, 2005, 2006. I think I know the female pilot who was one of the last to do it. And the reason is because it basically came down to necessity. Hornets, fighter jets and the E-2 obviously trap at night. That's just part of naval aviation, and it makes a lot of sense. But I think what doesn't make sense is the reason why they canceled it is because, one, the C-2 is old, and so we have a tendency to break. And a lot of times we have a tendency to break after we trap on the carrier. So we were playing, it's like, well, do you want this carrier onboard delivery asset to be broken on your ship when you need to be bringing supplies from shore onto ship? And like, was that worth it just to bring it at night? And now it's broken, stuck on the carrier rather than stuck. Because when you're stuck on land, obviously you can use international shipping and bring supplies. But when you're on the ship, you are the supply delivery vehicle. So there was that, and also the danger aspect, because our primary mission is bringing cargo and also people. So like I said, the enlisted officers, distinguished visitors. So the fear was that we were going to fly some senator out or some general from Greece or somewhere for a nice VIP trip, and then bad things happen, and maybe people in that aircraft it doesn't end well, and then you're also saying, well, was that worth it? Was that worth flying them out at night? So the answer is we don't fly out the carrier at night, and we haven't for probably about 20 years at this point. But we could. It's just not, they choose not to.
And I probably should have asked you earlier, Rob, but what squadrons did you actually fly the C-2 with?
Yeah, I was only with VRC 40. So VRC-40. V stands for fixed wing. R is a weird term for logistics. Obviously like VFA is fighter
Yeah,
attack.
yeah,
So
yeah,
R is
yeah.
logistics. And then, C is for cargo. So I flew with VRC 40. Uh, Back in the day, there were at least three C2 squadrons. There was VRC 40, 30, and 50. And today there's just VRC 40. And until recently, there was VRC 30, but I think they just sundowned it a few months ago because of the C2 being taken away. But back in my day, which is weird to say because I feel like it wasn't that long ago, but maybe 8 or so years ago, it was VRC 40 on the East Coast, VRC 30 in San Diego, California, and VRC 30 had a permanent permanent detachment in Japan. So if you were lucky enough to get that, you're a C2 pilot. Rather than me being in the Middle East, you're living in Japan, flying to the carrier, and that would be a lot of fun to go there for 3 years.